Hey,
Hey,
Evan, how's it going?
good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Man, I feel totally underprepared with comparing my background to yours. You got a lot going on back there. Really cool.
Well, it's just all the collection of my toys and stuff.
Well, great, Evan. It's very good to be here with you today. Thank you for taking the time to join all these wonderful people at Nux Nation and talk about Void Zero.
Yeah,
Um,
happy to. Yeah.
so, yeah, go ahead, Evan. Did you want to
No,
start out with something there? Awesome.
no. Let's just start with the questions.
All right, let's dive in. So, to start with, could you just introduce Void Zero and then kind of explain why it should be of interest to the people here at the conference?
Sure. So Voice Zero is essentially a company that aims. So I guess the bigger vision or the kind of tagline is we want to make web developers more productive than ever before. And to achieve that, I think we need to we're building a unified toolchain for JavaScript and web development. And to get there, we're essentially building on top of the existing open source projects that we currently maintain, namely Vite, Vitest, Rowdown, OXC, right? And among these, Vite and Vitest are already widely used, well adopted, people love them, but there are many things we believe we can improve from the bottom up and also extend beyond them. So the first opportunity that we see is we want to unify the internals of Vite so that it no longer relies on a bunch of different bundlers with different behaviors, and also we want to avoid this discrepancy between dev and production, where during dev part of your code is on bundled ESM, part of your code is handled by ES build, and during production, all your code is bundled by rollup, right? So we make them work, and it works for in most cases, but fundamentally, there are cases where things are just different between dev and prod, and we want to completely remove that from the developers' concerns. And we also want to make the production build many times faster than what can be now, right? So when we are looking into the bundler, we started also thinking about the even lower level things that the bundler would rely on, namely the parser, transformer, resolver, which is not only used by the bundler, but it's also used in things like a linter or a unit test runner. So I think vtest is a very good example of a unit test runner that actually builds directly on top of Vite, right? So this kind of giving me the idea like Vite can be, interestingly, Vite is now a kind of almost like a runtime that can serve an interesting purpose. And if we unify all the things inside of Vite, right, we have the opportunity to give developers a very coherent experience where, when you do web development, you would start your dev server, bundle your application, link your application, test your application, and even deploy your application all through the same unified toolchain, right? And we want to do it in a way that integrates well with frameworks built on top of each, of course, right? So, but the company is still really early, so the initial focus right now is mostly on the lower level Rust toolchain part, right? So we've worked on OXC and Rowdown for quite a while now. So Rowdown is close to beta, and OXC is its parser, its resolver are already very battle tested. So most of the things we're focusing on is just finishing the transformer. So for the transformer, TypeScript and JSX, those are already done. Right now, the biggest chunk left is really the target lowering transforms, namely like transpiling ES 2022 down to ES 2015, stuff like that, right? So some of the most tricky ones, like the async generator transforms, class-related transforms, these are the ones that we're currently finishing up, but most likely it'll be done before end of year. So Rowdown will essentially be in beta status by end of this year.
Exciting.
And we already have a version of Vite that's running on Rodan successfully for both development and build, and it's passing like all dev tests except for one. So actually, there's one case that we don't really cover is the legacy build. Like that's kind of like we'll think about whether we want to do it because by the
Sure.
time we ship it as stable, probably people don't even want it anymore, right? So legacy, if we ignore the legacy plugin, then we pass all the dev tests and we pass probably 80% to 85% of the build tests. So there are a few test cases that's blocked in by small implementation details in Rodan, but it's already working for most simple apps. Rollup and Vite plugin compatibility is at around 90%.
Wow.
So I think it's already pretty practical for people to actually build stuff with it, but we just want to polish it a bit more before opening it up for more wider public testing. I mean, you can test it. Like, we don't really want too many people start doing that just yet. Right?
Sure.
And some of the interesting things we already did. For example, we can already also use it in VitePress, for example. So we can use the Rodan powered Vite in
Mhm.
VitePress to build the docs for Rodan itself. So we also did a bunch of other interesting things like use Rodan to bundle Vue, which we've already successfully done. And it passes all the ecosystem, not only Vue's own unit tests, but also all ecosystem tests in the Vue ecosystems here. So the correctness and robustness of Rodan is also, we are dogfooding it to verify it's actually, up to the standard. And we're now looking into bundling Vite itself with Rodan. So it's all
Amazing.
like this kind of like meta process of like dogfooding the new stuff. And
Inception of Inception. Yeah.
yeah,
Very cool. Very cool. Well,
yeah.
it's very exciting news to hear. I mean, I know in the JavaScript world, sometimes like uh, just juggling things can be a pain, right? And the
hmm
idea of this unified tool chain is extremely exciting to me.
Yeah. So I think like one, very obvious state we want to get to is like so the Vite is the tool chain itself. So the scope obviously is a bit bigger than Vite, right? We not only want it to support Vite, but we also want to expand the scope a little bit to handle some of the most commonly used the tasks that you deal with in your day-to-day jobs for development. So it's kind of like if you use in a way, like if you use something like Bun or Dino, right? They come with a bunch of things out of the box. You
Mhm.
use a language like Rust, it has cargo, which gives you everything, almost everything you need for your development workflow. But for web applications, especially front end ones, it's traditionally been Wild West. So we want to, give people a sort of like a no-brainer starter point. Like if you start with this, you're in a good place. Right? You can get really, really far without having to look for a third-party dependency. And also, we want to kind of, not just for web applications, but for generic libraries, JavaScript libraries or front-end libraries that involve like Vue components or Svelte components or language framework specific thing that integrates Vite. We want to make building libraries for these frameworks also extremely easy, right? So we want to have like a more opinionated, baked in sort of library setup where the initial goal is I want to pretty much replace most of the third-party deps in the Vue dev dependencies, and just
Mhm.
like I want just like one thing that can handle the whole Vue workflow.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds super great. I was looking for a question on here that is related to what you just mentioned there. I can't find it, so I'm not going to show it on the screen. But in terms of like adoptability, what do you think like sets you, what puts you in the position to make this like the tool chain, right? Because others have
Right.
tried to attempt this before.
Yeah. So our biggest leverage is Vite, right? It's so Vite is probably the fastest growing solution for building web apps, right? People build single page applications with it, and then there are all these frameworks, including Nuxt, that's built on top of it. So it's almost becoming a shared foundation for the next gen frameworks
Mm.
So if you look at Next.js as its own silo, then everything else nowadays is just Vite, right? So if we get the toolchain, if Vite is running on the toolchain, then all those apps, all those frameworks are running on this toolchain. And by extension, when you use a toolchain, you want to use something. uh, if there is, so let's say you use Vite and it's running on OXC, running on Rodin, and now you have a different concern, like you want to test your app. You naturally, similar to how when you use Vite, you want to use vtest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're already using OXC, you naturally want its linter because it uses the exact same module resolution, exact same parser, exact same configuration for understanding your source code, like exact same way of interpreting your TS config, everything, right? So
Right. Why take the time
you
to try to configure some other tool alongside it when you can
exactly.
just
So when you use the toolchain and now say I want to add linting to my repo, there's no configuration that's I mean, you will need to configure the rules, but you don't need to configure anything about like how to parse my code. That's just like a given, right? Similar to how like when you have a Vite config and you use vtest, it just works. Like you don't have to reconfigure the plugins like you do with Jest.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. All right. So next question here for you, Evan. What objectives drive the launch of Void Zero, and is the aim to really replace or complement tools like Node.js, VS Code, or Vite?
The goal is never to replace things, right? Replacing things is the side effect of us trying to search for better development experience. So the end goal is better development experience. And if that means we have to rebuild things or replace things, then we'll do it, right? I think traditionally, if I'm running this as pure open source with just like crowdfunding or sponsorships, then I probably wouldn't be that ambitious. I would say, like let everyone do their own thing and we're just going to focus on the part we can handle. But on the other hand, I guess what I realized is if no one actually is committed to doing this, then the JavaScript tooling ecosystem is pretty much going to be stuck like this forever. And you do see other VC-powered initiatives like Bun, like Dino, but I don't really like the idea of having front-end tooling being coupled to a specific runtime and force you to say, if you want to build a web app, now you have to use Bun. I just don't think that's good for the ecosystem for for the wider tooling to be coupled to a specific runtime. And also, I think for one time, it seems that Vercel is up to owning the vertical stack because they hired the maintainer of Webpack, they hired the maintainer of SWC. So it looks like they're in a good position to do this, but somehow they decided to do everything only for Next.js. And it's a silo. It doesn't work with the rest of the ecosystem. So, and I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think sort of community-driven or independent open source will be able to compete on that level if we want to do this kind of unified tooling, right? So that's why I raise money. For us, raising money is kind of a means to an end. We want to, first of all, there are obviously two goals. One is we want to build this unified tooling experience that enhances Vite and make sure everyone gets a better development experience. The second is we want to establish a sustainable business model as a business so that it can sustain the long-term development of this tool chain
Right.
and sort of avoid the situation like I guess Babel and some independent projects where it becomes a critical piece of infrastructure, but somehow it struggles with funding, right?
Mm.
I don't think that's I think it's unfortunate, but that's the reality for a lot of infrastructure level open source projects in the ecosystem, is because they are important, but they don't get enough end user exposure, so they struggle with funding. And I think the way to one potential way to fix that is you sort of build find a business model on top of the infrastructure that you build. How can you leverage that? And I think also another sort of goal of the company is to monetize more in the larger business enterprise space, which traditionally has been, using a lot of these open source projects without really giving back. And I think
Mhm.
obviously we've tried many different ways to encourage them to give back, but the reality is it's really hard, right? I think Vue, like ironically, my experience with running Vue, like Vue is probably one of the more successful independent projects that's able to be raise enough sponsorship to sustain its long-term development. But compared to the scale of users that we impact, the amount that we actually get back is very small, right? And
Mhm.
also, there is a certain threshold that we can scale with this just like pure sponsorship model. Like we're not going to, get several $1 million to hire a full-time team of 10 people to work on this whole thing. So in a way, capital also help us accelerate this process by allowing a dedicated team of people who can just like stop worrying about sustainability issues for a few years and just like let's just focus on this 100% and get it actually realize this vision, right? So because I've also
Yeah.
firsthand witnessed a
For
lot of
such a foundational
developers.
piece of your stack, it's like you want that kind of dedication from a team, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
totally. And I've seen many developers like in the Vue ecosystem, for example, like they want to do more open source. They want to be able to dedicate
mhm.
100% to this open source thing, but at the same time, the mental burden of thinking about sustainability. How can I get more sponsorship? How can I make sure I can pay the check next month? That's a lot of mental toll on you, and that just prevents you from being able to focus, right? So in a way, raising money help us avoid that problem, which is I think really important.
For sure. And we definitely want to take care of the people that are putting their time
Hmm.
and effort into
Yeah,
this amazing tool, really.
totally.
Absolutely. Okay. So that kind of brings me to what does this mean for the Vue ecosystem, and in
Hmm.
terms of the kind of love that Vue is going to get from this tool chain, and just how it will impact Vue development.
So in general, you know, getting Roda into Vite obviously makes all the Vue apps and Nuxt apps built on top of Vite build faster, run faster. So that's kind of a natural benefit of it. The second aspect of it is I think when Roda lands, there are some interesting things that JavaScript plugins need to be aware of when like there are some patterns existing roller plugins need to sort of adapt to get better performance out of it, right? So
Mhm.
most existing roller plugins will just work with Rodan, but they are not optimal because there are a lot of patterns in roller plugins today or Vite plugins today that we do this sort of filtering inside the hook plugin hooks. So here's a plugin that it has a transform hook, and inside the hook, we'll check if this is, for example, a view file, and then we return.
Mm.
Then we do things, or otherwise we return. Right. The downside of this is the same transform hook actually gets called for not just view files, but all the TypeScript files or JavaScript files in your code base as well. Um, in the pure JavaScript, because in the pure JavaScript system, this is kind of doesn't really matter. But when you use this plugin in a Rust-based bundler, there is a cost every time the Rust calls a JavaScript hook.
Mm.
And that's sometimes more costly than actually running the JavaScript hook itself. So we want to avoid that as much as possible, which means we want to move that filtering check out of the hook itself to the plugin level. So the Rust side can actually get your filtering requirements by looking at the configuration. And then at execution time, it just filters things out on the Rust side without ever touching JavaScript. Um, so we'll do a lot of this kind of first, a lot of these early optimizations will apply to the Vue plugins to make Vue builds faster. And also there are some interesting things we're designing in Rodan. For example, uh, a some utility for JavaScript plugins to be able to receive the parsed AST directly with little with no memory copy cost from Rust. And then we provide an API that's kind of like magic string that allows you to traverse the AST and do manipulations, but in reality, there's no real manipulations happening on the JavaScript side. Like we are just recording what you want to do and send the instructions, which is very cheap, back to Rust, and then let the Rust do the heavy lifting of string manipulation and source map generation and all that. So this would allow some interesting things. For example, Vue's current single file compiler does a lot of this kind of string AST-based string manipulation. So when you have a script setup block, we do parse the whole thing and do like scope analysis and all that, right? Right now, all of this done is in Java. All of this is done in JavaScript. We're using Babel parser. We're using magic string, right? So ideally, in the future, we don't really want to rewrite the whole Vue compiler in Rust because that's going to be very slow, and we will struggle with keeping two versions in sync, right? But I think the best middle ground for us to leverage the Rust performance is for the build tool to offer, utilities for you to do. For example, essentially allow your JavaScript part to only express what you want to do, but leave all the expensive tasks to Rust as much as possible. So we'll design it in a way that allows, ideally allow the Vue compiler to also leverage it. So that will speed up Vue builds even more, right? And then obviously all the associated things that we build later, like linter, formatters, we will all consider Vue as a first-class citizen when the resource allows. I think obviously initial focus is just on pure JavaScript and TypeScript, but at a later stage, obviously framework support. When it comes to dedicated framework support, Vue is always going to be on the first in the list.
Yeah, makes perfect sense for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot just slightly here. We're going to talk about Vue for just a moment, and then we'll jump back into a little bit more Void Zero. But people are still, of course, very interested in Vue. So are we likely to see another major migration similar to the shift from Vue 2 to Vue 3 that will compel organizations to migrate larger projects?
Not anytime soon. So I've mentioned this many times, but Vue 3 is in a pretty stable place. So I think that overall the Vue's current API is in a pretty good place. So we don't intend to do any sort of paradigm shifting. Like by paradigm shifting, I mean something like Next.js 14, 15, where it just like completely changed how the routing works, right? Like, so it's kind of like, Vue 2 to Vue 3, we didn't remove options API, but for a lot of people, they think like Vue 3 is equivalent to composition API, and I think like, oh, it's different, right? It is indeed a paradigm shift because like slowly we see the ecosystem moving towards composition, right? So, but that has a cost, and we've already acknowledged that. So, so in a way, we're still paying the debt of that whole transition. So, like, we don't really want to do any sort of that kind of transition anymore. So I think the planning is pretty much similar to how Angular major versions work since Angular 2, right? It's also like a big shift, even bigger than Vue 2 to Vue 3. But afterwards, if you look at like Angular 3, 4, 5, all the way up to right now, like every major version, they changed a bit of small things, nothing major. Most of them can be automatically migrated. So there's no disruption to the project. Like, so we want to provide that level of stability for Vue 3. Like we want applications built today on Vue so especially on Vue 3, right? I think a big incentive for larger projects that's still stuck on Vue 2 to migrate, if you ever consider about migrating, right, is if you don't migrate, you're stuck on Vue 2 forever. But if you pay a one-time cost to migrate to Vue 3 today, right? Here we can guarantee you that we won't do ever this sort of Vue 2 to Vue 3 change again. So even if Vue 4 comes out, if you're already on Vue 3, the cost of moving up to Vue 4 will be very minimal. It, probably takes like
kind of the
an
same
engineer
approach
half a
that
day.
Nuxt is going 3 to 4, right? Very
Exactly, right? Very minimal changes. Like it's more like a semantic breakage. It's like we are shipping a major mostly because like there are breaking changes, but like you can just like, we may have just like automated tool that like automatically upgrade your project, right?
Yeah.
Or and also like if we ever do Vue 4, right? There's no real like formulated plan for Vue 4 yet. There are a few ideas floating around on what things we might want to change, but I think the bottom line is every potential breaking change we want to do in a future major for Vue is going to have, first of all, an opt-in period for you to actually opt into the new syntax ahead of time, right? And mark the old usage deprecated. Um, so you'll essentially be able to write kind of like the compat build, right? Where you'll be able to use the new syntax before the breaking change even happens. So when the new version lands, you've already done the migration. Like you're already, you just bump the version and you're done.
Right. Very interesting. Okay. And one thing I do hear a lot from, some people even still going from, 2 to 3 is they think they have to go to composition API, right?
Mhm.
And for those who are still in the process of moving from 2 to 3, yeah, that's not the case. You could still totally migrate with the
Yeah.
options API, right?
Yeah. I think like it's very like you should consider upgrading to Vue 3 and moving over to composition API, two separate concerns, right? Because
Right.
2.7 also supports composition API. You can move to composition without upgrading to Vue 3, you know? So they're almost like orthogonal decisions now. Like, do you want composition API or do you want to upgrade to Vue 3? Like, you can do both. You can do
Yep.
one of them, right? They're not really coupled anymore.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So just a curiosity question here. From a
Mhm.
JavaScript perspective, what is the significance of the term void zero?
Right. So if you evaluate void 0 in JavaScript, you get undefined.
Okay.
Void is actually a reserved word. It's a special operator that just like whatever expression you put after void, it gets turned into undefined. Yeah, and also because of that, so if you put undefined through a minifier, the minifier will shorten it to void 0 because it's
No
two
way.
characters less, I think.
Well, there you go. So why attach that? Why then use that as the name?
I think it has something linked to build tools, right? Because like if you build your JavaScript and ship to production, void 0 will appear somewhere. So
Very
your
cool.
production bundle already includes void 0.
You got free advertising right there, right?
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
yeah. It is
All
also
right.
like it's from like a very old school thing where somehow in the old days you would see HTML with like on click equals JavaScript colon void 0, you know,
Oh,
uh,
yes. Okay.
right? Yeah. So this is actually also where that's from. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Will existing projects like Vite be transitioned to the at void zero dev repo?
Not anytime soon. I don't think we have plans for that just yet. So void 0's GitHub organization will likely host new projects that's specifically made by void 0. Um, so we do want to. So one thing we want to keep is like Vite has its community, has its established ecosystem. So I think moving it to a company org is kind of disruptive, and I don't really see strong benefits of doing that. Right. We also really want to keep the community driven vibe of these projects for as long as we can, ideally forever. Right. So the company repositories will likely be more, I don't know, they are still open source, right? But they may also host some private repositories of commercial related things.
Makes sense. All right. Are there any other projects out there right now that closely align with Void Zero's current goals and visions, and how might you work with them?
Mm, I think like OXC was originally an external project, and we essentially convinced Boshen to join the company and essentially make OXC properly funded so that it becomes the foundation of everything we build. And in a way, like we hire people on the projects like VTest, because technically VTest was also like its own team, its own thing.
Mm.
But the companies like Void Zero felt like VTest aligns with our vision really much, like pretty much perfectly. So we hired Vladimir, we hired Hiroshi, um, who are both on the core team, and we hired Safi, who's on the Vite core team, right? So I think currently we're just trying to either hire or support people that are aligned with this. I think some of the interesting things, like for example, the UnJS ecosystem from Nuxt has a lot of align. I think there's a lot of interesting room here for collaboration. Like I was actually just talking to Puya earlier today, looking at like Nitro and ServX, which is this new thing. Uh, we talked about Jitty. So I think like Nuxt is built on top of Vite. Um, there are some interesting parts where we can be more aligned internally, to reduce the sort of overlapping responsibility or duplicated efforts. And then there are some places we can sort of, for example, make Vite environment API and Nitro presets somehow aligned. That's a possibility. So there
I
are a
like
lot
the
of
sound of
interesting
that. That
things we
sounds
can do
interesting.
there. Yeah. Yeah. So like this is just one example. I think we are
Sure.
also thinking about on a higher level of things. I guess like because our scope is really big, so there's no like close equivalent. We're more like seeing things that are complementary, right? For example, like we're probably not going to get into like package manager anytime soon because like
Mm.
we think PNPM is doing a great job. So we're just gonna focus on the parts where we think we can make really meaningful improvements.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Um, so another question from the audience here. I think we touched on this just a little bit.
Mhm.
But how do you anticipate OXC replacing ESLint and perhaps making IDE tools like Volar more efficient?
Yeah, so these are kind of two separate things. So I do think OXLint has the potential to replace ESLint, but that's kind of like there are also obviously things we need to resolve before we can actually achieve that, right? So if you just want an out of the box ESLint experience, I think OXC is a very good drop-in replacement for a lot of the rule sets that it has already implemented, because it's like orders of magnitude faster than ESLint, right? But ESLint's current biggest strength is its extensibility. So you can write your custom rules and all that. And in OXLint currently intentionally does not support custom JavaScript-based rules because allowing, so there are some tricky design problems that we want to sort of solve, right? How do you efficiently expose the AST to the JavaScript plugins? How do you give, essentially it's the same thing that I mentioned earlier. How can we like leave as much heavy lifting to Rust as much as possible and let the JavaScript plugins only sort of express the intent, not the computation? So that's a design challenge and that we want to get right. And that also means in some way the plugin API will be maybe a bit more limiting than the ESLint API. So you won't be able to do the same level of manipulation like you do in ESLint, right? But I think that's kind of a good thing because the other opposite is we allow the same level of JavaScript plugin flexibility like ESLint does, then people will write rules that make the whole thing slower, right?
Yeah.
And it'll defeat the purpose of faster tooling. So we want to find a good middle ground there, right? So
What about in terms of like, could someone write a Rust plugin and have more flexibility if they actually wrote it in Rust as opposed to writing it in JavaScript that you
writing in Rust is also challenging because you need to compile the whole thing together, right? So one middle ground is probably WebAssembly rules. So you write your rules in whatever language that can compile to WebAssembly, and communicate with Rust through, WASI. Um, that could potentially work. For example, I think Dino had that, or SRC had that for a while. But there are some opinions in the team that think this is kind of a shaky ground to build on top of. But I'm not an expert in WASM Rust interop here. But
Same.
yeah, some people who's more opinionated on this, in the team kind of has something to say. But I kind of forgot about the details. But it's also something we kind of eventually will do more thorough research on. Right now, the linter is not really the focus because linter is kind of in a state where it's the architecture is working, there are more rules being implemented, but JavaScript plugin for the linter is kind of deferred before until we finish the transformer, and we also have the minifier, which are another big chunk of work. And then we'll probably have more bandwidth to properly think about JavaScript plugin design. So as for IDE tools like Volar, the thing is Volar is different from ESLint, right? They do different things. So although they both have language servers, language server performance is fundamentally bottlenecked by the tool, the actual tool it's running. So if ESLint is slow, its LSP will be slow, right? If OXC is fast, its language server will be fast. So Volar's performance is largely limited by TypeScript, because Volar, we need to be more specific because right now Volar has been extracted into a sort of language framework agnostic toolkit, right? So if we talk about more specifically the language server for Vue, the Vue language tools, its performance largely bottlenecked by TypeScript because we need to run TypeScript diagnostics to get the hints, right? So in a way, to make Volar faster, TypeScript is something that we cannot get around with, but there are potential things we can do. For example, just make Vue template parsing faster, can make Volar faster. Make Volar maybe, its code gen can leverage OXC to be more efficient. I think that is something that could potentially happen, right? Because Volar does do a lot of code manipulation to generate the final TypeScript code that it sends to the TypeScript language server for type checking. So if we can make this sort of Vue file to TypeScript, and Volar actually generates very complicated TypeScript. Basically, it converts your Vue template, your Vue single file components, into a big chunk of complicated TypeScript, and then send it to the TypeScript language server, get the diagnostics, then maps it back to the original location in your Vue components.
Wow.
Right. So I guess the part where it can benefit from OXC would be to do the component to checked code this phase, make this phase a bit faster. So there's definitely room for improvement there.
Interesting. I didn't. Yeah, I've never heard it laid out that way. I didn't realize Volar was doing so much work like that. All right. Would you recommend OXLint if I have junior developers on my team versus ESLint, or is it intended to be used in conjunction with ESLint for now?
So it all really depends on whether the current OXLint rule set covers your needs, right? For example, at Shopify, what they did is essentially they turn off any rules that OXLint already implements. They still use ESLint with OXLint, but they can turn off hundreds of rules that OXLint already implements and only use ESLint for some very specific rules or custom rules that they need, right? So this way you can kind of leverage the best of both worlds. Because typically, I think Shopify's repo is 60,000 lines of code or more. Like the original ESLink setup runs like 8 minutes. So with OX linked, it's 8 seconds, right?
That's a big
So
difference.
for your typical size of application, OX link probably links your whole thing in like several hundred milliseconds. And then you can run ESLink for a few rules that you don't really have in the OX linked,
Right.
which
So
would
you
be
get the
much, much
speed from
faster.
OXLint for the majority of rules, right? And then you just
Yeah.
okay. All right. This question seems very far out of my pay grade, so it may not. I might not even know how to ask it, but let's just give it a try. Uh, are there any plans for post quantum encryption tech getting built into the ecosystem, gentlemen? Rust based would probably be a good go to.
I have no idea what that is, so probably not.
Okay, glad I'm not the only one. Um, all right, so this kind of harks back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, but
Mhm.
is Vue feature complete? If not, when will it happen, if at all?
This is an interesting question. So first of all, I don't think we can call an open source project ever like feature complete. For something like Vue, I think the the main reason is that the requirements and the expectations is always changing, right? So like in Vue's early days, like in Vue 1, when I shipped Vue 1, I'm like, I'm done. Like this is the best library ever. Right. But just 2 weeks later, I'm like, wait a second, like, oh, people actually need to do this. People actually need to do that. Right. So a lot of the need for new features is discovered over time with real user feedback. Right. So even now we have a big backlog of pull requests we need to merge, right?
Mm,
So there's definitely a lot of things we can ship, but many of them. But like when you think about features, they can vary wildly in terms of scale. Like there
mm,
can be
and
like really
impact.
big features like Vapor, right? Or for example, when we stabilize suspense, it's going to be kind of like a big feature, right? But it could be also really tiny features, like just a quality of life improvement that makes a certain API slightly more ergonomic, right? That's
Mhm.
also a feature. So I think like we are we are intentionally moving a bit slower on the big feature side because big features tend to even if it's a non-breaking feature, they often involve a lot of like they can change the way you think about things. They can change the way you do how you deal with a problem, right? And usually they are also, require a more involved design process, right?
Sure.
So I think like on the big feature side, we focus on just a few things and one at a time, right? But there will be always be these like streams of small features that's continually rolling out. Right? And these are kind of like either people just like ask for it, they send PRs, and we are like, oh, we didn't, we never thought like you to do this, so maybe we should support that. This is just like gonna happen all the time.
Sure. Absolutely. And speaking of suspense, just for my curiosity's sake, like, do
Mhm.
you see it changing anymore until it becomes stable, or do you think it's pretty solid as is?
I think the API probably won't change much.
Yeah.
The internals, there are still a few things I feel like I want to get right, but I don't really foresee big API changes.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, my go-to line for people always ask, they see that little, warning and they're like, Daniel, is this going to change it? Yeah, and I'm like, look, Nuxt is using it like hardcore. I don't think the API is going to change that much. So I'm glad to have
Yeah,
validation that that's
because
I'm
like
actually giving accurate information.
most of the issues we now have with suspense are just implementation issues or bugs, right?
Sure.
We haven't really got any sort of like suspense makes this impossible, or you need to like redesign this so to make this work. Like we didn't get feedback like that, so that's a good thing.
Cool, cool. Makes sense. All right. Seeing how much time we have left for questions here, I'm going to keep throwing them up until my team tells me otherwise, but I think we're getting a little short on time. Um, is there any plan for a official Vue native like React native?
No. So again, I've also answered this many times. Building something like Vue Native takes probably more effort than building Vue itself, mostly because you are now essentially branching iOS, Android, the bridges between it, and all the tooling associated with it. Right? It's a lot of work. So all the people working full time on React Native, including those working at Expo, probably like I think there's at least like half, probably 50 people or more, like maybe even 100 people working on this whole thing, right? So it's a very steep investment that a project like Vue is just not going to do, unfortunately, right? I think there were efforts of doing this. Like I think if we really want something like that, obviously there's like native script, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think native script view is actually usable, right? It's just not as widely adopted in the industry like React Native is. But I still think it's a viable solution if you really want like you know use view syntax for render to native. Um, and in China, there's actually a solution called UniApp that allows you
Say the
to
name
use
of it
views.
one more time.
UniApp.
UniApp.
Yeah, but its target audience is not. It's mostly focused on Chinese market, where the main need is to use the same view syntax and compile to different mini program formats.
Hmm.
It can also compile to native iOS and Android, but its ecosystem is mostly Chinese. All the documentation and everything is in Chinese. So it could be challenging for English-speaking devs to actually use it.
Yeah, but it sounds like some of the heavy lifting of the actual, programming work is done. Maybe some good documentation work could bring it to
Yeah,
other
like
places.
people can probably look into it. And I think there has been like a Vue Native initiative in the past, but kind of abandoned, probably because after that they realized how involved this actually is. I think Tari is planning to do native support soon, but Tari is kind of a like it's still a web view, right? It's not like real native. And finally, I did once had the idea of probably like using the lower level Flutter rendering engine, but like compile view syntax to run on top of Flutter's rendering engine. It's like I think it's Skia underneath. But again, like all of this is like it takes a lot of work. It's like a whole new project, so we just don't have the bandwidth to actually do it.
Sure. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right. So this person looks like they might be interested in joining the team. How did you decide on who to hire from Vite, Vitas, OXE teams?
Mostly by for example, Borchin says like, so we hired Overlook Motel, who's on the OXC team, and it's mostly because Borchin says like this guy is crazy good at Rust. Like he knows more about Rust than I do, and he's been optimizing. So before we hired him, he sent in a few PRs that just like every PR made OXC like 15% faster. So we're like, wow. We need someone like this to just like focus on making things fast, and then I guess for V-test like and everything, we just talk to people and gauge their interest, right? If they're happy where they are, we don't try to like force them to say like you definitely must join us. Like we can't really do that, right? I think naturally a lot of people, for example, like Vladimir, he wants to spend more time working on V-test. So for him, that's like a really natural fit. Most of the people working on these, so if they are contributing a lot to V-test or OXC, and they have the intention to work full time, right? We're basically looking through the most active contributors and then
Yeah,
talking to them one by one, pretty much.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you do want to work with Evan, start submitting those PRs and make some beautiful contributions.
Yeah, and I think like the right now the company's hiring, like we're kind of like on hiring freeze because we already have like
Mm,
a team of 10. But um, the idea is we basically start with hiring only people who are already passionate about these projects without previously even being full time, right? So that's like a prerequisite. Like turning them full time is only sort of giving them the financial uh backup to say like now you're probably paid, you can focus 100% on this without worrying about like juggling between open source and your day job or that stuff. At a later stage when we like scale beyond that, but contributors like this are sort of hard to come by. Like you don't run into this kind of people every day, right? uh in a way, it's really hard for people to sort of be consistently contributing to an open source project very significantly before you even get hired, right?
mm,
So that's a high bar, really. So that's why like when we see people can do that, like we will try to hire them, right? But it's not an easy thing to do.
right.
Um,
It's
I
not
think
something
at
you just
later,
throw a few PRs in there and oh, I'm a hireable. I
yeah,
I yeah.
right. At the early stage, it's really like you need to have the passion and commitment. You're like, I love this project. I want to make it great.
Absolutely. That's exactly who you want working with you, for sure.
Yeah.
So along that same line, what do you think the job market will look like for Vue, um, maybe in the near future and then the distant future as well?
Um, that's really hard to say. I think in the distant future, I think all current day technologies have this looming sort of AI on top of them in some way. Um, so I think it's more less about the specific technology, but for like just today's developer tools in general. There's going to be this like also like it depends on how you define distant future. It's like 50
Right.
years from now, probably none of us will be writing Vue anymore. Uh, but I think like in the short term, maybe in the 5 to 10 years scope, I think it's still going to be stay relatively healthy. I just read the 2024 report of open source. Right, that's published by the OSI Open Source Initiative. Right, so its target is more generic. It's like across the whole industry, different size of companies, different regions all over the world. So I think it's more representative of actual industry adoption, also like more globally perspective, right? I think Vue's job market is a bit imbalanced in different regions of the world, right? Like for example, React is very dominant in North America. Like I think there is the Facebook and Silicon Valley network effect. It kind of creates this echo chamber where everyone's using React, so we can hire for React. But I think Vue does a lot better in non-US market. Um, People are more open-minded and are not, dogmatically say, "Oh, this is what big Silicon Valley companies use. We're going to use it." For example, I was just told today that the biggest stock trader platform in India, um, what is it called again? Uh, Stock market exchange India, the online one. If there's someone from India, they probably know. But like they serve
Right.
16 million users with
Wow.
like 1.6 billion revenue, and run by the company has like 12,000 employees, but only 30 of them are engineers.
And
And their front end
it's
is
got a
all
view stack.
Vue. Yeah, the front end is all Vue, but I think they only have two front end engineers. which is crazy.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah. Then
testament
they have
to
like
productivity with you.
yeah, like they have like the backend systems in Go, and then Flutter for iOS and Android, and then Vue for front end. Uh, it's like I think like fundamentally at today, like there's really no defining difference at the technical level between what you can build with React, Vue, or Angular,
Sure.
right? So in a way, you will see companies that I think a lot of the decisions to use React is just based on like because others are doing it. Like it's kind of like no one gets fired for using React, but if you know what you're doing and you have your taste, you have your preference, right?
Mhm.
There are quite a few companies using Vue, and in the report I mentioned, right? So I think like 2,600 people interviewed. So 24% of the companies used React, 11% used Vue, right?
Mm,
So that's like, by absolute numbers, that's not bad. Angular 16%, I think. And this is in comparison to other very well adopted technologies like .NET. Like Vue has higher usage percentage than .NET. Uh, so in a way, like, I think there's like plenty of Vue adoption of the world, right? We're still seeing the numbers growing globally. Like we crossed like 5.5 million this year. That's like, you know,
wow.
Vue actually keeps growing like 20 to 30% every year, even now. Um, so I think like the job market thing, I don't really have first-hand experience because I haven't been looking for job for a very long time. But um, I think in a way, some Vue users probably want us to be more proactive, like marketing Vue and like
Mm,
creating a better job market. But as an open source project, we don't have a marketing manager or anything like that, right?
right.
So we kind of have to rely on partners like, maybe Vue School to do some of that.
Absolutely. Maybe some ways we can expand a little bit. I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Um, awesome. All right. Um, let's keep talking about Vue just a little bit here. Is
Mhm.
there an easy way to run React UI lib components from within Nuxt with SSG? Maybe this is not the right place to ask this
Sounds like
question.
an abomination to me. Uh,
Yeah,
unless you have really good reasons, I really, really don't recommend it. The one thing is like React components, and especially in the future, with the direction React is moving, like server components just require very dedicated and specialized setup, right? I don't think you should do that, to be honest. You're probably better off just using React in this case. Uh, but
that-
that said, depending on which UI library or component you're looking at, for example, I think we have high quality equivalent for almost everything nowadays. Like say, if you're looking for ShatCN, there's an equivalent based on Radix UI. Nuxt UI is really good, right?
yep.
Prime View is really good. Vuetify is really good. Right? If you want material design, you can use Vuetify. If you want like unstyled components, you can use Radix
Mm,
or View Prime, Prime View unstyled mode. If you want something that's just really nice out of the box, Nuxt UI, I think, especially if you're using Nuxt, right?
mhm.
I
And I
think
think
Nuxt UI
Daniel
is
just
just
had
kind of
that working with like a vanilla Vue app the other day, like outside of Nuxt, so you can use it.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, I think I would say look more inside the Vue ecosystem, right? And
absolutely.
if there are specific things you think the React component library does better, try to just raise that issue to the closest thing you find in the Vue ecosystem. Let them know where it can improve, and maybe even contribute it yourself.
Awesome. All right, last question here, Evan. We are almost out of time. We talked about suspense, but what about Vue Vapor? What's the status on that?
Right. So We just started merging Vapor development back into the main repo, and there will be probably some. I think we've got the performance kind of sorted out at this point, but I think for Vapor there are a few things we need to do before we can call it beta. The first is async component support. The second is hydration. So once these two are done, I think we can start having, maybe in 3.6 beta, we'll start allowing people to play around with Vapor directly. But the timeline is kind of a bit uncertain because we have a lot of things planned on the roll down Void Zero side of things. So, but I'm trying to carve out a period of time where we focus on Vapor and push it across the beta finish line. Not sure if it's gonna be feasible this year, but I think Kevin. So we now have a few people interested in working with that. So Kevin just got new sponsorship from Kazupan. So I think he's gonna also be able to dedicate a bit more time back into Vapor, and then Edison and Little Sound on the core team are both now also spending a bit more time on Vapor. So we're gonna try to, because it's been kind of in a sort of paused state for a few months, but now we're kind of trying to restart it.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that update, Evan. And that is all the time we have. Evan, do you have just any last words you want to share with everybody here at Nuxt Nation?
Well, enjoy the conference and keep on Nuxting.
Thank you very much, very much for joining us, Evan.
Yeah.
I had to sneak on stage and say hi.
Hi.
Hi, Evan.
Hello.
And thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah. We gotta let Sebastian in.
I know.
All right.
Thank you both.
Signing off. Bye.
All right, y'all. Quick video before we get to go to Sebastian's talk.